And then
Sorry, I just started recording
okay.
just to not miss anything.
No, it's all right. So as part of my master's with the University of Leicester, I did an empirical dissertation on nurses and doctors and the moral distress. So that's what I'd like to present today, and hear the other researchers here. That sounds wonderful too.
That's really nice. Thank you so much for being here and to agree to present and everything. Okay, so who is the first one to present, guys? It's you, Assel?
Yes, it's me. Shall I go ahead then, Amanda?
Yeah, Eloise, it's okay for him to
Yes, it's absolutely fine. I've turned my video off because I think it all got a little bit lagged up, but I can hear you fine now. So yes, please do go ahead.
Sure. Let me share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Perfect. Good evening again. As I said before, as part of my master's in occupational psychology, I did a dissertation, empirical research on the ethical dilemmas faced by healthcare workers at a COVID-19 facility here in the UAE. It's a very brief overview of what I did, and I'll be talking about the methodology. Please feel free to jump in and just talk your way through. Okay. So this is how I've broken down the slides. There's a literature review, a methodology. If the findings are broken into 4 core themes that I felt were necessary to address, and a conclusion, future initiatives and limitations. And in the literature review, I like to talk about why moral distress is important, what relationship it has with other occupational stresses, and what are the instruments that we have to measure it at the moment. So moral distress was first coined in 1984 by the philosopher Andrew Jameson. He was observing nurses before he started to figure out that this was a phenomenon. It's not part of nursing language, it's not part of our daily vocabulary, but it's been there's about 30 years of literature on it from nursing and veteran literature. It's referred to as the ethical canary because it has a connection with the organization's poor ethical climate that could signal the need for system changes. There's several studies that point out a relationship with moral distress and psychological and physical health among healthcare professionals, such as causing anger, anxiety, and even digestive disorders. Within the pandemic, in almost all perfect scenarios, existing resources will be overwhelmed, mostly because the number of patients that are coming into the hospital that require intensive care, intubation. And just as in any natural disaster, urgent clinical decisions have to be made. And these can contravene the morals of the doctors and nurses who have to make them, and they could be perceived negatively at the individual level. So we could assume that ethical frameworks or frameworks that guide ethical decisions might have to shift, and will be forcing our caregivers to suddenly violate their morals. So it's hard to anticipate how nurses and doctors and any frontline caregiver will react in a crisis. It's a bit complicated. The earliest instrument we have is the moral distress scale from 2002. It had 32 items, but it focused only on critical care nurses in end-of-life situations. So that's the basic, that's where we started. But 10 years down the line, in 2012, we shortened it. So that became the MDSR, the Moral Distress Scale Revised. Not the most creative name, but that's the instrument we were using till 2 years back, till 2019. Now we have the MMDHP. That's the Measure of Moral Distress in Healthcare Professionals. That's the study that I wanted to utilize, because the previous literature was, they kept using the old instrument. So it's high time we use something new and expand on the new instrument as well. The more studies we do on a new instrument, there's more baseline levels to compare against. So, and the MMDHP is negatively correlated with hospital ethical climate scores, and is also associated in previous studies, in a few studies, with intention to leave. So it's a valid measure of moral distress. Right. So this is the MMDHP. It has 27 morally distressing scenarios, and nurses and doctors or participants have to report how frequent it is and how intense the experience is during clinical practice. So frequency is measured from 0 for never and none, and to 4 for very frequent and very distressing on a Likert scale. An overall composite score is calculated by summing all the scenarios up. So the minimum is 0 and a maximum of 432. This instrument is also special because it has 4 root causes. Factor 1 relates to system level morally distressing scenarios. Factor 2 is for clinical patient level scenarios that are focused on patient care, and 3 and 4 about teams, maybe integrity and communication between team members. Aside from these 27 scenarios, there's a small free text scenario. So basically, the participant can fill out a special section that says another scenario that wasn't covered in the 27, and then report whether it was, how frequent it is and how distressing the process was. So my study has three simple primary aims. Is to adapt the measure of moral distress for healthcare professionals, the MMDHP instrument, to the UAE. One, I want to understand the level and range of moral distress among physicians and nurses, identify which healthcare professionals were at greater risk depending on their unit and depending on their occupation, whether nurses and doctors, and point out key characteristics that might predict moral distress in the future, and a demographic that might be sensitive towards moral distress. So ethical approval was obtained from Sheikh Khalifa Medical Cities Institution Review Board and the University of Leicester's Ethics Committee. During collecting ethical approval was the hardest step in this research, especially during the pandemic and in the healthcare setting. Sheikh Khalifa Hospital is a JCI, Joint Commission International Accredited Tertiary Referral Teaching Hospital, and has around 790 beds. My sample was full-time nurses and physicians who are willing to participate regardless of their age, gender, and hospital unit. In addition, I had a exclusion criteria of any participant with less than 1 year of work experience was excluded, because they had a similar study done in Saudi Arabia that had a similar exclusion criteria, which I used the demographic scale for this study. Overall, I had 496 participants with a completion rate of 47.9%, of which 219 were nurses, while 16, or that's 6.7%, were physicians. 3 participants didn't report their occupation. A majority of participants were female and in their 40s. Nurses who participated in the study were on average 8 years younger than physicians. Notably, 60 participants, that's 25%, 25.2, reported that they intended to leave their current position due to moral distress. The results in overview, healthcare professionals reported moderate levels of moral distress. In comparison to Epstein, who created the instrument, our study had higher mean score for nurses, but a lower score for physicians. The top 10 ranked items for both occupation groups are in the next slide, which I'll show you. Critical care healthcare professionals reported higher levels of moral distress compared to non-critical. So that's ICU and ICU staff compared to the staff that work in wards. Also, the current study was able to confirm a 4-factor structure. The one that was shown in previous studies for MMDHP, and showed an association with intention to leave and employment decisions. That I did that by using a stepwise regression model. Again, in this study, we were able to validate the instrument as a measure of moral distress. So these are the top 10 ranked morally distressing scenarios for both nurses and physicians. The most distressing scenario reported by physicians was the financial pressure from insurers and management. It could suggest there's a monetary constraints. There could be institution double bind in terms of monetary constraints that hinder treatment, best-in-class treatment. Likewise, nurses highlighted excessive documentation as the most distressing scenario. There's a growth of research that shows that completing medical records was a strong indicator of occupational burnout. And more studies are starting to report on high degree of stress involved in electronic health record environments. Both groups also ranked working with abusive patients and families at similar levels. It could suggest that the general uncertainty of the pandemic and widespread misinformation may have increased incidents of violence and harassment. I don't have much data on that aside from this, but previous work done by the WHO showed that violence against physicians have increased during the pandemic. These are like 4 discussion points. Overall, physicians reported higher levels of moral distress than nurses, which conflicted against their role as primary caregivers. You would typically assume doctors who order labs and order services, who dictate treatment, to have less moral distress because they are in control of the treatment, of the process. But in this study, we found that they were the ones who were reporting higher distress level, again, primarily due to financial constraints compared to nurses. And moral distress is essentially a nursing related concept. It began with nurses. It was first coined because of nurses, and it's been heavily in nursing literature. So this was a bit interesting, finding that doctors were reporting high levels than nurses. And another interesting aspect was that critical staff reported higher levels than non-critical staff. You would typically assume doctors and nurses who work in ICUs are used to making difficult choices, things that go against their moral compass. And you would assume they would be more resilient, but this study found that they were not in this particular sample group. And further exploration was, again, the MMD is a very valuable instrument because you can break it into 4 factors. Another exploration found that this difference was because of patient level incidents. So it's not system level constraints from the financial side like in the doctors, but rather when taking care of patients, they feel difficulties. And so this is a nice place to target future interventions and maybe address ethical dilemmas while that arise during patient care. Limitations. While the study was open to nurses and physicians, there was a heavy nursing representation in the 90s, in the low 90s, I guess. While it's high, this matches with previous work that's conducted on moral distress. Nurses tend to fill up these surveys more than doctors because this is a topic that's more close to heart, we could say. But because there's insufficient physician data, we can't really draw connections in this particular case. Likewise, the study was conducted at a single center, the Sheikh Khalifa Medical City, the hospital. So you can't really generalize it for other hospitals, maybe in the region or in Dubai, for instance. Similarly, like I said, in the free text scenario in the MMDHP, it was noted that the instrument lacked certain COVID-19 related scenarios because this was instrument made before the pandemic. So future studies could use a more expanded version that focuses on patient support, maybe fears of contamination that nurses and doctors might have while treating patients. Additionally, this study and the Latimer 2020 study that's done on mechanical ventilator nurses, again, small sample group. So these are the only few studies right now that have used this instrument in the pandemic. So they work as exploratory research, and future studies can build up on this and create, like, use the baseline that we have established. In closing, This study provided a valid measure of moral distress in Sheikh Khalifa Hospital while confirming the utility of the MMDHP. An important next step is to integrate additional healthcare settings and target a larger population, possibly of physicians as well, and in particular in the UAE for greater comparison. Ultimately, studies with MD moral distress during the pandemic provide critical information on psychological support and impact. Now, with climate change, with population growth, there's going to be further healthcare emergencies on the line. There's monkeypox on the way too. So we need to create like the appropriate infrastructure to protect against our healthcare professionals. We could almost say that we had a parallel pandemic with our nurses and doctors going through this trauma, but suddenly because COVID's slowly going towards the horizon, we're taking a few seconds to pause and think about it. And now we are realizing the trauma might have a long-lasting legacy. But if we don't build up on this information or plan ahead, we might repeat our mistakes again. So that's why I'm trying to do research on the pandemic, so we prepare for hopefully not another pandemic, but for another healthcare emergency. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for taking time. Like with me, for example, like I listen to these and I don't have questions immediately. It takes me a while to digest, think about it, and move along. If you do have any, if something comes up in a week or two, or you have a research initiative that you would like to discuss, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I love to talk about it. You can connect with Eloise, and if Amanda's okay, she can link it up to me, and I would love to have the opportunity to discuss. The more people I meet, the more people I talk about, it helps me develop something better, and it also helps me impart the very little knowledge I have on this topic. And yeah, thank you again for taking time to listen to me. I love to hear your feedback, whether now or in the future. I really appreciate it. And here are
lovely. Thanks so much, Assel. That was amazing. Really, really thorough. I really liked how you set the scene and gave us quite a nice introduction to moral distress to really help us understand what you were researching. I had a question. I can't remember what it was. It's an interesting point you made about the instrument not having any inclusion of COVID, obviously because of when it was made and, obviously not having that kind of knowledge. But it would be really, really interesting to see how they might update that, because I think each and every one of us has experienced a little bit of moral distress in the sort of aftermath of COVID, sort of at that period when we were just coming out of it and we had the stages. It did make you really think about, who you're meeting, what the impacts of meeting up with people could be. So yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
There's a study I'm sorry. There's a study in the Netherlands that's expanded on this MMDHP. It's added another maybe 18 items, and that's important because I think all of us faced a little trauma and we're still recovering, but especially the nurses and doctors, and it's a bit nuanced. Sometimes it's all about, I can't see the patient up front, and then sometimes it's all about touching a patient's hand and showing compassion, and then you can't even do that at this point. You're talking to them behind maybe a glass wall and with all your covering. So there are studies that are expanding, but the one in the Netherlands is really interesting. It was just a few months ago.
Yeah, it links with your point about learning from the pandemic and taking the lessons forwards, to make sure that we don't perhaps get as impacted as severely again in the future.
That's true. Yeah, 100%.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Has anyone else got any thoughts or questions that they might have? No? Excellent. Well then, should we move along? Thank you so much again, Assel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So next up, was it Rhiannon?
Yeah, it was. So I'm just going to share my screen because I've also got a presentation. So if you can just let me know when you can see it.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. So thank you very much for letting me come and talk today. This is the first chance I've actually got to talk about my research, so I'm very excited. So I'm Rhiannon Gray, and I graduated from the University of Leicester in January. I did my master's in occupational psychology, part-time through them. And what my dissertation was around stress, burnout, coping strategies in the pandemic. And it was around what helps, why, and has this changed? And what I wanted to do was really take a qualitative look into children's social care workforce perspectives on this. And I'll explain a little bit more in just a couple of slides as to why that was my focus. So just a little bit about why I did this and where the research was pointing me. When I started to look into the research about stress and burnout, quite often it had two main focuses, and that would be about what causes stress. So thinking about all the different things that may cause stress, such as thinking about like Hertzberg's two-factor theory, which was one of the main things that I looked at. And also as well, then what works to reduce stress was another key area. But when I was looking into what reduces stress and what works to reduce it, it was predominantly quantitative studies, mainly on employee assistant programs. And it was focused really on a division between individual and organizational interventions. But what was coming out when I was looking into the research was that actually some research was saying that it was individual interventions that worked best, and others were suggesting that organizational interventions worked best, but there was no real focus on why it was working. And also as well, when I was looking into it, it really only focused on a few specific workforces primarily, and they were medical professionals, mental health professionals. There was some limited research into social work and teaching, but quite a few were suggesting that actually it would be beneficial to look at it in a wider picture as well and look at some other at-risk workforces. And also as well, when they were looking into the interventions, most of them relied on co-creative narratives, so really bringing people together. And so what I started to think about was looking into as well the different types of coping strategies that people may use. And that's where I started to look into emotion-focused versus problem-focused coping. And so what my research became was really about the three objectives, which was to explore why people felt things worked, and then also when that was, or what context they felt things worked in. I wanted to explore it with the wider workforce as well, so look outside of just social work itself. And I was very fortunate that I actually work within a local authority for a children's social work directorate, social care directorate. So I was able to work with the whole workforce. And also as well, I wanted to explore how the pandemic had impacted on their coping strategies and how this might have changed things, especially with that in mind about the co-constructive narrative being really at the centre of most interventions. So my method, my design was that I did some semi-structured interviews, and they lasted between 25 and 58 minutes. And the questions really came from the literature that I was looking at. I managed to develop them in an open-ended style, but I also used a romanticism position because these were people that I had worked with. I wanted to really kind of build a relationship to try and get as much rich data as possible. And then to analyze the data, I actually used template analysis, which I chose to use because it has such a it has such great benefits. It's fantastic because it has the flexibility of thematic analysis, but then it has also as well the benefits from grounded theory. So it allowed me to really shape my theories as I was going on and look beyond what was said and look more at themes that were emerging, to be able to create cross-cutting themes across the work, the data that was coming out. So my participants, it was quite a small group. It was only 7 participants, and these were found through a combination of self-selection. So I sent out advertisements across the workforce and asked people to nominate themselves to be part of it. And also as well, some were purposely approached to see if they would be interested in taking part in the study. Did some snowball sampling as well, and ended up with 7 participants across the workforce. My participants were predominantly female, which I had anticipated because social care does tend to be a predominantly female setting, at least within the local authority that I work in. And there was a range of roles and experience, and these ranged from support and administrative roles up to senior management roles as well. Everyone had a minimum of 1 year plus working within children's social care, and they all had worked for the same local authority, or at least had up until a very recent point when I conducted the research. So a little bit about my themes. So because I chose to do template analysis, I went into looking at my research with some priori themes. So these are themes that basically I thought I might find based on what the research was suggesting. And my priori themes were around change, causes of stress and burnout, problem-focused coping strategies, and then emotion-focused coping strategies. And then when I actually conducted the research and went through the process of creating the template, my top level themes, so my overarching themes, ended up being these 7. So causes of stress, symptomology of stress, coping strategies, why it helps, change, trauma and vicarious trauma, and emotions and feelings. And the blue ones are the ones that I focus primarily in my discussion on my dissertation around. So this is, and hopefully you'll be able to see it okay, this was a simplified table that I did of the top and second level themes, and there was many other themes that kind of sat within those. But the ones that I mainly focused on, like I said, was coping strategies. So from the data that I collected and when analysed, what I found was actually that most people, in fact, all of the participants actually used more emotion-focused coping, specifically things like creating space and distance or talking to someone removed from the workplace to actually help them cope with work. Also as well, they used things such as altering their mindsets, so being able to take themselves out of that mindset for work, and also permission giving as well. So giving themselves permission to do things to help them cope with work. Few used problem-focused coping strategies, but the few that did, actually, they used it to cope with a situational stress. So for example, it was primarily in those that provided support or administrative roles and it was working through something like that, or those that were covering more than one role at that point in time. But one of the things that came through as well, that actually one of the factors that was that I found when I was analysing the research was that permission giving was a very big feature of this, and it featured also as well in the unhealthy side of coping strategies, because they had quite a lot of feelings about inability to cope but not being able to feel that they could approach people to talk about this, and that tied in with my emotions and feelings sub-theme as well. And so it was unpicking that and looking at that. And also as well, they suggested solutions on what would help for them. And a lot of the time what came out of that was around emotion-focused strategies as well. And when I was looking at why it helps, a lot of it was around helping them to process the impact of their work and the self-regulation. But also as well, it was around when it was around giving input, it was more around giving permission or people being told that they could do things, and that was what seemed to help the most. And the change was another big theme, and actually I considered looking at that as a meta theme because it did have overarching elements in all the different themes. But actually, when I unpicked it a bit further, I felt that it was a separate theme of its own, because actually the way it impacted on different people, because what I found was actually that it had negative and positive connotations on people's coping strategies. And actually what came out most was that in some ways, the virtual working had been a blessing for some, and that's what how they described it in their own words, was that it was a blessing and they were able to actually work better in that way. Whereas actually some felt the opposite as well. And it was also, as well, as I said, one of the key things that were really brought up was around emotions and feelings. And I looked at that in quite a lot of detail and reflected on whether some of that was because actually they knew me because I worked within the organisation. They were able to kind of discuss their feelings a little bit more freely than maybe if I was someone from outside of the workforce. So what came from it. So I had some suggestions for practice. I've also got some ideas about further research if I'm able to do extra research. But one of the main things that came from it was around actually the reintegration of the workforce is going to be a crucial next step for the organisation. So thinking about virtual versus hybrid versus face-to-face, because as I said, for some people there was positives as well as negatives. Also, as well, a careful exploration with those in support or administrative roles, because the data that I processed and found showed that actually some of them felt that it was quite a negative thing, the home working and the virtual solutions. So looking at how that could be explored and seeing if that was across a wider participant base as well. The impact of trauma and vicarious trauma on the workforce started to come through as people were talking about it, and it was felt that this would be beneficial to be looked at on a whole workforce scale and work out whether actually something should be offered around this to the whole workforce. Also, as well, the importance a manager plays in terms of that sense of feeling safe and being able to talk about things really came through in the data as well when I was looking at the themes. And so there was talk around what a good manager meant and what a bad manager meant. And so this could have connotations for leadership initiatives, culture change work, and work around psychological safety within teams. But one of the big things that came out as well was the thinking around bringing people together in a space physically rather than just virtually, post-COVID, whatever that may look like. But also as well that some work needed to be done around destigmatizing using coping strategies and acknowledge that it is essential to use coping strategies. And some of this could be around permission giving and thinking around additional time off. Also as well, there was areas to explore that maybe actually this could be replicated on a larger scale. And I also thought that it would be useful to kind of look at this across other authorities as well and seeing if this was the case across different places. So in conclusion, I felt that my research really kind of added to the literature scape. It supported the literature as well around the topic because it really kind of reinforced around hygiene factors playing a role in stress and burnout. And it also did show that people used problem-focused strategies in response to situational stress. However, it challenged the literature as well because what was present in some of the literature was that actually they said social workers would use more problem-focused strategies, but actually when I was reviewing the research, most of them were using emotion-focused rather than problem-focused. But then we have to also add the caveat that this was during the pandemic, and actually that could have had an impact as well. So that's my research in a nutshell, basically. I'm happy to talk to anyone about this further if they wish to, especially around things like template analysis, because I absolutely love it. I'm really happy to talk to people more about that if they're interested. And just to say, if you've got any questions, I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thank you so much, Rhiannon. That was really, really good. I felt like you took us along every step of the journey there. I felt like I was with you doing this research and this template analysis. I was just going to ask, what sort of, so I feel like there is very much, when it comes to your master's dissertations, you sometimes get the quantitative and the qualitative camps, and the quantitative side are very much like, I don't want to deal with that much, those many words and those sorts of things. What kind of skills do you feel like helped you out sort of conducting this research and doing this project? Is there anything that you would?
Yeah, so what I felt was, I truly felt, because I chose to do qualitative, I felt that actually through conducting the actual research itself, that ability to actually have those conversations with people really was useful. By trade, I am a trainer. I work in learning and development, which I talk with my hands as well, which you may not be able to see, but I am actually moving my hands under the camera at the moment. But I think that was really useful. But also as well, I think there is a lot of people think that qualitative doesn't have that data eye, but it really does when you're doing that thematic analysis. And I'd really challenge people that there is a real eye on that data, and actually you're having to interpret it as well, just as you would through putting data into SPSS. You're still having to interpret data. The template analysis, I ended up on 5 different templates by the end of it, and it was a lot of work, but yeah.
And you can tell, this is what I like so much about research, I think, is that when you were telling us about your initial themes that you were thinking that you were going to find, and then to see, how actually on the other side of the analysis, you had this whole list of themes, and each and every one of them was just as important and valid. And yeah, it was really, really quite interesting. Thank you so much. Anyone else got any thoughts, questions they might have for Rhiannon? I'm doing a Nikita and I'm counting to 30 in my head, but it just makes me so uncomfortable. Well then, should we move along? Thank you so much again, Rhiannon. And are you okay for people to reach out to you if they have any questions about anything?
Yes, more than happy. If people want to reach out through LinkedIn, more than happy for that.
Great, thank you. Finally then, Beatrice.
Yeah, let me just share my screen. Yeah, are you guys able to see my screen?
Nice and clear.
So yeah, hi everyone, I'm Beatrice. I'm currently doing a master's in occupational and organizational psychology at the University of Sussex. And I'm specifically right now working on my master's dissertation, which kind of builds on the findings that I got through my undergraduate dissertation. That is what I'm going to be focusing on today. And I conducted this research at the University of Sussex, and it was as part of my degree in business and management with psychology. So just the broad topic was mental health stigma and kind of the antecedents and consequences of stigma around mental health among employees. Obviously, I feel like it is, we all know that there has been a growing acknowledgement of the importance of mental health recently, both by the general population, but also in the world of work. And specifically, I think because of and during the pandemic, this was emphasized as well. But mental health problems are extremely prevalent among working populations. And obviously, in addition to having very negative effects on the individuals suffering from them, they also have detrimental costs for organizations in terms of economic and productivity costs associated with mental health related absenteeism, presenteeism, and turnover as well. So for this reason, I kind of decided to focus on this topic, and I was looking at the research, and I found that there is still a lot of stigma around mental health. I think that is kind of something that a lot of people maybe disagree on, because the general public kind of says that mental health is being destigmatized, but then the literature actually finds that yeah, it is still very much a problem, the stigma around mental health, and most employees still report not feeling comfortable to disclose a mental illness when they join a company, or to talk about problems and struggles with their mental health with their line manager, because of their fear of being stigmatized or discriminated against. And a lot of research has been conducted on the factors affecting stigma around mental health in employment. But one of the factors that has been suggested to affect stigma, but hasn't really been empirically researched as much, was the mental health system, and specifically the degree of decentralization in a country's healthcare system. And I thought that this was specifically important to look at because of Brexit and the current climate in the UK, because even though the UK has a very centralized approach to healthcare at the moment, it has been suggested that more and more healthcare services will be privatized in the UK, and this would lead to a more decentralized approach to healthcare, which, as the literature kind of suggests, might have a negative impact on how mental health is perceived. But I wanted to specifically see if this would still be the case in the workplace context specifically. So in terms of what the literature suggests around the impact of healthcare delivery on stigma, it seems that in countries with where healthcare is very centralized, there is higher treatment coverage for mental health problems, or lower territorial inequalities in access to care, and there is generally a lower mental health care funding gap. So this suggests that in general, it seems that countries where healthcare is centralized have better access to healthcare. And there seems to be a very high prevalence of managers that choose to avoid discussing issues around mental illness with their employees in countries where healthcare is decentralized compared to where it's centralized. And this has been suggested to be kind of due to the lower general awareness of mental health problems, which maybe makes managers and employees a bit more uncomfortable in discussing these issues. It has also been hypothesized that healthcare decentralization might have a negative impact on absenteeism, but that hadn't really been investigated empirically up until around when I was doing my research. So I was also interested in looking at that. And then in terms of the relationship between stigma and absenteeism, it is the literature does suggest that increased absenteeism might be a consequence of more negative attitudes towards mental health problems, both in the workplace but also in other samples of just the general population, but specifically in the employment context, research has found support for the relationship between managers' prejudicial attitudes and higher absence rates among their subordinates. But I noticed, just reviewing the literature, that no one had really looked at whether employees' stigma towards their co-workers suffering from mental health problems had an impact on their co-workers' absenteeism. So, because it looked like just the research that had been conducted so far was very interested in the role of managers, which is obviously very important. But I thought that co-workers might also impact absenteeism levels because of their stigma. The aims broadly of my research were to assess whether healthcare delivery, specifically a country's degree of healthcare decentralization, had an effect on mental illness stigma and on absenteeism. And then I also wanted to look at the relationship between stigmatizing attitudes and absenteeism. And I did this by looking at stigma and absenteeism in 2 different countries, the UK, because it has a very centralized approach to healthcare, and in Italy, because it has a very decentralized and regional approach to healthcare. So in terms of my methods, I managed to recruit 166 employees, and they were employees working either full-time or part-time in the UK and in Italy. I measured their demographics, and my specific demographic variable of interest was what country they live in. So I basically assumed if they answered Italy, that they would have access to decentralized healthcare, and if they responded that they lived in the UK, they would have access to centralized healthcare. I then assessed their stigma using Martin's Manager's Affective Stigma Scale. And then I looked at their absenteeism rates using the Gallatley and Luhut's perceived absenteeism. Obviously, I wasn't able to obtain actual absenteeism data, so it had to be based on the participants' perceptions of absenteeism in their organization. And yeah, I collected data using a cross-sectional quantitative approach, and I used 2 different versions, an Italian and an English version of the same online questionnaire. So in terms of my findings, I did an independent samples t-test to look at the differences between participants living in the UK and in Italy in terms of their stigma and absenteeism. And my findings did show that employees living in the UK had lower stigmatizing attitudes towards mental health problems, and they also had lower absenteeism rates. And then in terms of the relationship between stigma and absenteeism, I did find significant positive correlation between stigmatizing attitudes and absenteeism. I also conducted an analysis of covariance using stigma as the covariate in order to see if after controlling for stigma, there would still be a significant effect of healthcare delivery on absenteeism. And I basically found that, after controlling for stigma, there was not a significant effect of healthcare delivery on absenteeism, and this suggests that stigma is the main factor affecting absenteeism and not healthcare delivery. So in terms of kind of, the key takeaway points that I took from these findings, it does seem that a country's degree of healthcare decentralization has an impact on stigma, and this might be potentially due to differences in funding and access to care. And I think that this is quite important, both in general, because of the current post-Brexit climate in the UK and what it would mean to go towards a more decentralized approach to healthcare. But I also think that this could be applied to the workplace, for example, and companies having a more decentralized approach and strategy for mental health and what this would mean for their employees and their employees' stigma levels. And then in terms of the relationship between employees' stigma and their co-workers' absenteeism that I found, I think that this is quite important because it shows that managers obviously play a role and their attitudes towards mental health play a role in their subordinates' absenteeism, but employees are also important. And so I think that, interventions targeting stigma should focus really on employees as well as on managers. And this was kind of, where my undergraduate dissertation ends, but I'm kind of building from these findings for my master's research. If anyone wants to either know a bit more about that or has any questions, I'm really happy to to answer any and like discuss my research. So yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Beatrice. That was really clear. I really like the delivery. It's very good. Yeah, please do tell us a bit more about your master's dissertation and where this has taken you.
Yeah, so I'm basically, let me just stop sharing. For my master's dissertation, I decided to focus just on the UK because I thought that healthcare delivery is obviously important. My findings at least showed that it does have an impact on stigma, but I also thought that there might be other factors such as cultural factors that might have an impact on that. So I focus specifically on the UK, and I'm kind of looking still at antecedents and consequences of stigma in the workplace, but focusing on individual level antecedents, specifically knowledge of mental health, and whether that predicts stigma. And then I decided to add to my outcomes presenteeism rates as well as absenteeism, because I thought that specifically after COVID, because of COVID and remote working, presenteeism might be more kind of prevalent as a consequence, in addition to absenteeism as well. And the research seems to suggest that, but obviously no one has really tested that in relation to stigma yet, because it's kind of a more, like a newer concept. And so I'm basically going to be looking at that and then doing some mediation analysis to see whether stigma mediates the relationship between knowledge of mental health problems and the consequences of stigma, absenteeism and presenteeism. So yeah, I'm going to start collecting data really soon. So yeah, if anyone wants to as well, get in touch on LinkedIn. I will be sharing the questionnaire very soon. So yeah.
Amazing. So when do you hand that in? Will that be a September hand in?
So when I'm handing in my dissertation, that would be end of August. But yeah, I'm going to be starting to collect data around in about 2 weeks, hopefully. I should be getting ethical approval really soon. Just depends on when my supervisor comes back from her leave. But yeah, I'm going to be starting to collect data in a few weeks.
You'll have to come back and tell us the findings of your master's dissertation once that's complete. We'd love to have an update.
Yeah, I would obviously, love to, yeah.
Amazing. Great. Has anyone got any other questions or thoughts?
No, I just want to thank you all guys also for the presentations. It helped me to learn new things and it was really nice. It's always good to share knowledge. I'm also doing my master. So and maybe in September in the other event that Eloise will launch, right, Eloise? I will present also my thesis. And thank you so much for sharing. And I'm waiting for the results of the Beatrice thing, research. Thank you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all of you. Yeah, amazing.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Did you want to stop recording, Amanda?
Yeah, I will stop recording now. So